Welcome to First Do No Harm with Massachusetts Citizens for Life board member and physician Dr. Mark Rollo. This broadcast will focus on medical ethics from a Catholic perspective and address abortion, physician-assisted suicide, contraception, natural family planning, IVF, healthcare proxy, and other topics. Please be advised that this show may not be appropriate for children under 13.
Hello and welcome back to First Do No Harm, a show about medical ethics from a Catholic perspective. I'm Dr. Mark Rollo. Last time you heard part one of my interview with Dr. Kris Correira, pro-life Catholic clinician in emergency medicine and in family medicine. She explained some of the modern-day roots of physician-assisted suicide, which includes the evil of eugenics. This corrupt ideology also undergirds the anti-life mentality of contraception and abortion. All three entities, contraception, abortion, and assisted suicide, are fruits of the same anti-life tree. All are part of the culture of death. All are directed at eliminating inconvenient, unwanted life. For example, Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of the American Birth Control League in 1921 and the Birth Control Federation of America in 1939, which became Planned Parenthood in 1942, touted contraception as a way to eliminate certain minorities whom she considered human weeds. Abortion quickly followed the contraceptive mentality to eliminate unwanted life that contraception missed. Assisted suicide is a natural evolution of this unnatural process of eliminating unwanted life, unwanted by the individual seeking to eliminate him or herself, and unwanted by the society which agrees that such suicidal individuals are better off dead. Today you will hear part two of my interview with Dr. Kris Correira as we continue to discuss the modern-day roots of assisted suicide, which includes eugenics. This corrupt ideology, among other things previously mentioned, initially brought about forced sterilization. And I'm not talking about China, which has forced sterilization as well as forced abortion. I am talking about forced sterilization in the United States of America. You will hear Dr. Correira refer to a Supreme Court decision from 1927, Buck v. Bell, which ordered the forced sterilization of Carrie Buck. The 8-1 decision declared that Carrie Buck, the, quote, feeble-minded daughter of a feeble-minded mother, and herself the mother of a feeble-minded child, could be forcibly sterilized under the 1924 Virginia Eugenical Sterilization Act. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in the decision, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." You will hear me laugh at this statement during the interview, not because it's funny, for it's no laughing matter, but because of its absurdity. Nevertheless, this decision established the legal authority for forcibly sterilizing more than 60,000 U.S. citizens in more than 30 states before it finally ended in the 1970s, largely due to opposition from the Catholic Church. It is noteworthy that the only dissenting vote in the Buck v. Bell decision was a Catholic. It is also noteworthy and eerily ironic that the case cited in the 1924 Virginia Eugenical Sterilization Act, which led to Buck v. Bell, was another case which came from Cambridge, Massachusetts. That 1905 case, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, mandated Cambridge minister Henning Jacobson receive a smallpox vaccination against his will during the outbreak of smallpox at that time. Sound familiar? Now, before resuming the interview with Dr. Kris Correira, let us, as always, begin with prayer. For as stated by the U.S. Catholic bishops, only with prayer that storms the heavens for justice and mercy, prayer that cleanses our hearts and souls, will the culture of death that surrounds us today be replaced by a culture of life. O God, help us discern between just laws which protect human life and the unjust laws which allow and even mandate actions that are in opposition to life. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. And now, part 2 of my interview with Dr. Kris Correira.
In 1927, this country legalized forced sterilization. Supreme Court decision. Do you ever hear about this infamous, horrible Supreme Court decision, Buck versus Bell?
Rarely.
No.
Rarely.
Right. Oliver Wendell Holmes infamously penned in his decision that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
Yeah, that's...
because they mistakenly thought that so-called feeble-mindedness was a hereditary disease. And so it was wrong. The science was wrong. And so they instituted forced sterilizations, which went all the way up throughout the 20th century.
Yeah,
and was
incredible.
Even put into the budget, into the Medicaid budget. And this wasn't just Democrats. Nixon did the same thing. A lot of Native Americans, a lot of immigrants were all sterilized. A lot of them. In fact, there was a great case that I came across where this man left this money to his daughter, but if she died without a child, it would go to his wife. So she went in for an appendicitis, and the wife went in and told them that she was feeble-minded, so they sterilized her. So she guaranteed herself that her daughter would never have offspring. That's how common it was, how easy it was to do.
I guess that's sort of it's sort of being done. There's the whole case of Britney Spears being made to have an IUD that's recently been in the news. So,
that's right.
So that sort of thinking has certainly not gone away. And of course, in communist China, it's still very common to have not only forced sterilization, but forced abortions.
Yeah, to control population, but
right.
it's still the same idea that a government could impose this. A lot of people going in thinking they're having their appendix out or and had no idea, no informed consent.
Amazing.
And were just sterilized.
Amazing.
Now we use long-acting reversible contraceptives.
Yeah.
Lovely, right?
Yeah.
We just implant devices into young women.
Yeah. How do you see this as kind of feeding into the current spreading of physician-assisted suicide?
Right. Well, in 1938, the Euthanasia Society of America started, and it was actually fueled by the infanticide acceptance. As people were accepting infanticide, it was easy for them to accept euthanizing people who were, quote, suffering. And guess what? They used personal stories about putting suffering children and spouses to death. But at the same time, now in Germany, 1920, there was a book called Allowing the Destruction of Life Unworthy of Life, out of the Eugenics movement. By 1933, the Nazis take over in Germany. The first thing they did was began forced sterilization, and they adopted the policies in California because it was working so well here. First it was the children, then it was the adults with physical and mental disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the only reason they were forced to stop in 1941 was because of the overwhelming pressure from the Catholic Church within the country. They shut down the T4 program, but turned it into the same lethal mechanisms that they used for the Holocaust.
Just to add on to that, even prior to the Nazis, the German medical establishment was euthanizing disabled people and psychiatric patients.
Yes, that was true. Yeah, that's how this action. That's what this Action T4 program was. They put psychiatrists in charge to go around and go through institutions and say, okay, this one, this one, this one.
What did T4 stand for?
T4 was the address of where the regulation was first signed off. It had no real designation. That just happened to be where the office was, and so that was the address of the office.
Sort of the office of Eugenics, sort of.
Right. I mean, it wasn't quite that, though there was one in Germany, but it was as indescript as that. And then now here in the United States, so this is when the Euthanasia Society of America is going. It's Reverend Charles Potter. He actually came from Marlborough, Massachusetts. He grew up as a strict Baptist, but he was moved to believe that man was redeemed by his own creative power. It was back to those philosophers from the Enlightenment. He became a Unitarian, but they were not radical enough for him. He began the Humanist Society of America in New York. And he really pushed for assisted suicide. But what happened in Germany made it so that he never really got it off the ground.
Yeah.
He dies in 1962. But there's another reverend that comes up that takes his place, and that's Reverend Joseph Fletcher, who's an Episcopalian, who also did move to Unitarian. He's a professor of moral theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge. So, sadly, the roots of assisted suicide are right here in the state.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just as an aside, I remember we were talking about this, that Joseph Fletcher was sort of the father of situational ethics, and when I was going to Holy Cross in the late 60s and early 70s, he was required reading. And he was the one that kind of turned moral theology on its head. And instead of saying the ends don't justify the means, he turned it completely around and said only the ends justify the means, which is basically anything goes as long as you have a good goal.
When you tell me that story, it was like history coming alive. He wrote this book, Morals in Medicine, 1954, blockbuster bestseller. He hits every one of these issues on abortion, contraception, euthanasia, and says we need to do it. Religion's in the way. And then he wrote Situational Ethics in 1966, and now here I hear from you, it was required reading for a few years.
Required reading at a Catholic college.
Right, and that was the scary part. Well, and that turns into the last phase of this. So he left Cambridge and went to the University of Virginia. There he started the Medical Center Hour, where he would be talking with medical students about these situation ethics. And he was involved with another religion professor named James Childress. Now we're in the 60s here, right? In the late 60s.
Yeah.
1969, the Hastings Center is established. The Hastings Center is still going and has all kinds of bioethics. They've become a bioethics center, even though they didn't use the word because it hadn't come into use yet. But all kinds of stuff comes out of the Hastings Center, some good, some not so good. They are secular, not based on a Catholic thinking or a natural law thinking. So by 1970, we've got this Medical Center Hour. And then in 71, the Kennedy Institute of Bioethics is established at Georgetown. Catholic institution. And that was the first use of the word bioethics. There's some wrangling that there was a guy at the University of Wisconsin who used it first, but he meant it towards the environment, right? When you talk about bioethics. Here it was Andre Helligers, who's an obstetrician, who opened the institute, and he used the word Institute for Bioethics. So that was the birth of the word and the idea of bioethics.
Interesting.
Soon after that, we had the revelations of the Tuskegee trial. There was a whole national discussion about ethics in medical research with human subjects. And we get the Belmont Report, which was written by Tom Beauchamp, who was from the Kennedy Institute. Sometimes that the Belmont Report is referred to informally as the Kennedy Report. And he comes up with these three pillars: respect for person, justice, non-maleficence.
Mm-hmm.
He's at Georgetown, right? So that's not too far from University of Virginia. We're all talking the same little area here.
Yeah.
He teams up with Childress, who was the guy that was with Fletcher to start this medical hour.
Right.
And they write a book called The Principles of Bioethics in 1979.
Mm-hmm.
And that book is put into the hands of medical students across the country and used. And that's where we get the 4 pillars.
Yes.
First, do no harm, non-maleficence, and then care for the patient, which is beneficence, autonomy,
yes,
and justice.
Right. Those are the big buzzwords now, right? The people being autonomous and social justice and that sort of thing.
Right. But where before it used to be first, do no harm, maleficence was at the top, autonomy has come to take over the other ones. This is called principle ethics, because you've got these 4 principles and you try to adjudicate among them. Mm-hmm. And, if you have 4 different ones, depending on which one you stress, you can get a different outcome of what you think is right or wrong. Really, it should be first, do no harm. That should be taking the prime thought. Autonomy, and again, because of the fact that autonomy is about me and what I decide is right and wrong, which again comes from these Enlightenment philosophers, that's where we get into the mess we're at today.
Right, and that's what you hear all the time when we go to these hearings on assisted suicide. You'll have people talking about autonomy. They wear badges that say, my life, my death, my choice. So it's all about an individual's radical autonomy.
That's right. Now, when you think about natural law is about, in Catholic thinking, the natural law is something anybody can figure out using rational thought.
Right.
So Aristotle, Plato, all came up with based on our human nature. We're all striving for happiness. There's an ultimate happiness, and the Catholic Church, of course, teaches that's the beatitude. That's where you see God face to face. That's what we were made for. That is what we're striving for, and therefore flourishing will help whenever we do something leading to that goal. But we're not individuals. We live in a society. When you have this radical autonomy, which John Paul II talks about this very clearly in both Veritatis Splendor and especially in Evangelium Vitae, everybody becomes an enemy of one another because I have my autonomy that I want, and you have yours. It's no longer about trying to get everybody to flourish, because we're battling over our own individual morals. It's no wonder our society is so divided.
Yeah, the idea of solidarity is out the window.
And people would say, well, how can you say, there's different cultures, there's different societies. How can you say that there's some, natural law that abides by everybody, that's universal, that's objective, and that's understandable? How can you say that? And it's the analogy of, like Chesterton said, like this is the walls outside that we don't go beyond. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't kill. That's sort of John Paul II called it like the floor, like the bottom you don't go below, the so-called negative precepts. Those just form the boundary. Everything in there can then be about individual societies and how do we do this as Americans versus Europeans or as Asians, in whatever culture you're in. But it's those outside boundaries that the natural law, which is not religion-based, that's what's supposed to guide us. And that's where autonomy completely goes against, because autonomy is no longer about the society. And laws now become, we've got this new thing. Oh, look, we've got this new trick that science learned. It's called artificial reproductive technologies. Mm-hmm. Oh, I want to do that. Mm-hmm. I'm autonomous. It should be a right. We're going to pass a law that's going to force the medical community to give it to me. And that's what we saw with abortion. This is what we're seeing with assisted suicide. It's all about passing laws just to allow individuals to have their radical autonomy, not about what it is to help the society. And assisted suicide, as you and I know, and we've been trying to ring the bell, it has very negative effects on what happens in the rest of medicine. It has nothing to do with whether you choose assisted suicide or not. It has to do with how it changes the culture of medicine. Say, okay, it's okay to look at somebody and say, well, you know what, that life's not worth trying to save. That life is not worth treating.
Right.
We need to really, go in and get the most on that patient. Go in and get the DNR on that patient, because we really don't think that they should really be resuscitated.
Right. So it's like
Mass General has a policy that they can do a unilateral DNR. It's right in their policy manual.
So that kind of gets us into the whole idea of MOLST, or medical orders of life-sustaining treatment, because if you have this culture of death, this culture of life not worth living, this culture of I'm the master of my own destiny, I can do what I want, and not realizing that what I do has effects on other people, that kind of leads us into the development of medical orders for life-sustaining treatment, which is kind of an offshoot of, in some ways, of physician-assisted suicide. And coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, both of these movements originated, at least in this country, originated in Oregon.
Yes, it did. I don't know if you remember the Patient Self-Determination Act.
I don't remember that.
I found out an interesting fact that in 1973, the AMA adopted a patient's Bill of Rights to allow patients to refuse treatment. Okay? Since that time, actually, that was 73. In 76 was the Karen Ann Quinlan case.
Yes.
I remember the Karen Ann Quinlan case, right?
Right.
And where they wanted to stop the treatments. And they were very open about the fact that they were Catholic, because there has been Catholic language from Pope Pius XII, his declaration on euthanasia, that gives us the idea that if something is too burdensome, that's long been in the Catholic tradition. So in 73, there's been this Karen Ann Quinlan in 76. And then in 1990, there was this passage that was called the Patient Self-Determination Act. Now, I knew this because I started in 93 in the emergency department, okay? What the Patient Self-Determination Act declared was that any federally funded institutions, so that includes the hospitals and rehabs, nursing homes, all of them, that they had to inform patients that they had a right to make their healthcare decisions, and they asked to make advance directives. And they were told that they could, but it does say clearly that you could not discriminate against them if they refused to create advance directives. So that was the push for the advance directives. And if you look in the literature at the time, there's a lot of writing that says the only way we're going to save money in the healthcare is if people stop, because they kept talking about all this care, we spend all this money in the last year of somebody's life. Well, money is, you die, you get sick before you die, most people.
Yeah.
Like, why is that such a,
Right. That's where you spend most of the money. When you get sick.
When you get sick, right.
And that's usually in the last 6 months of life or so.
Right. Well, because people get sick and then die. That's
yeah. So that's the best place to save money, right?
It makes no sense, right? Why have a healthcare system? So that's the patient. And I remember when I started in 93, because that's pretty much when it's really starting, the policies are starting to get written and everything. And they're telling us, okay, this patient's getting admitted to the hospital. You have to ask them if they want to be resuscitated or not. It was so odd to us. Yeah. And the resident would come down, the admitting resident would be like, you need to ask him. No, you're admitting him. You need to ask him.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And eventually they decided, that that was a discussion for the admitting resident. But honestly, it's not a good discussion to have. It's not a good place to have the discussion to begin with.
No, you get these people who are not necessarily all that sick, and they all, when they get admitted to the hospital, they're all of a sudden asking you if you want to die, which it's very scary to patients to get that kind of questioning.
You're there trying to comfort them and trying to give them some hope because you're barely even in the ER. We half the time we don't even make a diagnosis, right? We're about resuscitation and stabilization, right? And kind of getting an idea of where they need to go. So that really pushed this conversation business, right? It forced it into the healthcare system. And it's very interesting because they specifically call them advanced directives. The first thing you'll be told about a MOLST is that it's not an advanced directive. So it doesn't fall into that category where it says, well, we can't, you're not allowed to discriminate against somebody for not wanting to sign an advanced directive. Well, MOLST is now outside of that. So these advanced directives weren't enough. They had to then come up with MOLST on top of it, something that was even more demanding.
Yeah,
okay?
And people get pressured to sign these, and they're often made to feel like it's mandatory when it's the furthest thing from mandatory.
It'd be easy, wouldn't it, under this Patient Self-Determination Act to create a lawsuit and say, I'm not supposed to be forced to sign these.
This concludes part 2 of my interview with Dr. Kris Correira. Tune in next time when you will hear more about the potential abuses of advanced directives and especially MOLST, Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, which includes paving the way to physician-assisted suicide. The 2021 Assisted Suicide Bill is now before the Massachusetts legislature. It is euphemistically called an act relative to end-of-life options. Call your state representative and state senator today at 617-722-2000. Don't let them weaponize advanced directives and MOLST. Don't give them the bullets with which to kill you via state-sanctioned medical killing. Tell them we already have end-of-life options. They are called hospice and palliative care. They are called walking with your brother in compassionate care and welcoming the burden of his suffering and helping to alleviate his pain. Tell them you want your doctor to continue to be a healer and a comforter, not a killer. Until next time, remember, we should always treat life with care and respect. And at the very least, we should first do no harm.
First Do No Harm with Dr. Mark Rollo is produced at WQPH 89.3 FM, Shirley, Fitchburg. We are very happy to share it with other networks.
Thank you for tuning in to First Do No Harm. Dr. Rollo welcomes your questions and comments. You may contact him at markrollo978@gmail.com. That's MARKROLLO978@gmail.com. Thank you, and until next week, remember, first do no harm.